Salvation Army co-founder Catherine Booth said, if we are to better the future, we must disturb the present. This is the Disturbance podcast from Salvation Army Women's Ministries.
Hi to mine. Welcome to the Disturbance podcast. Every human being is important. Sammy just said that to me as we were chatting before. It's one of the foundational principles of the Salvation Army, and it's what we're talking about today. It goes right to the heart of what we do and why we exist. We're talking about human trafficking and modern day slavery. I just want to start with a little personal story. Several years ago, I was doing a mission trip to Thailand, and I, along the lines of conversation, met a woman who had worked in the sex industry. And I said, how did you end up in Thailand? Because she said she came from a neighbouring country. She said to me, well, someone came to my village and they promised me a job, but when I got here, the job was in prostitution and I couldn't tell my family. She told me this in broken English. It was only about 10 years later that I heard the word human trafficking, and I realized that's exactly what had happened to this beautiful woman that I met. I've never forgotten her, of course. I wonder how many of us have had these much closer brushes to human trafficking or modern day slavery than we actually realize. It's happening all around the world. Statistics tell us that there are 40 million victims of modern day slavery, and it is happening in our territory. But did you know that we, the Salvation Army, and we in our territory are working on combating modern day slavery or human trafficking? And I'm joined today by the wonderful Sammy Millar, Captain Samantha Millar. She is the Territorial Traffic Response Coordinator or Trafficking Response Coordinator for New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga and Samoa. Hi, Sammy. Hey, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us, for those of us who don't know, a little bit about yourself?
Hi. So I am Sammy. I was born in Napier. I grew up in Palmerston North. We're from the Manawatu area, and Palmy and Napier are kind of the places that I call home. Mm-hmm. So I love being appointed to Napier. My husband and I are currently court officers in Napier, so I feel really at home here. I'm married to Brenton. We have 4 amazing children. I've been part of the Salvation Army since a child. A friend of my mum's started taking me along to the Salvation Army when I was about 3 or 4.
Really?
And we started off in Woodville Corps and then to Levin. And I never left. I found home at the Salvation Army, and people just really embraced me and loved me and cared for me. They took me under their wing, and I met Jesus, and I just always knew that Jesus was real and that he was for me. And just grew up in the army, and
that's so beautiful.
Now I'm an officer and getting to kind of work in the area of my passion. And
how amazing. So tell me, Sammy, you've got this, so your core officers, you've got this like side hustle, it seems like a very, very big job. Human Trafficking Response Coordinator. Can you tell me what is human trafficking and why is this part of the Army's international mission?
Yeah, so in its really basic form, human trafficking is the sale and purchase of human beings. And right from our early days, the Salvation Army identified this as an injustice and got involved in combating it. Elizabeth Cottrell, back in the 1800s, she took a victim of human trafficking into her home, and then went on to purchase a home and that housed victims of human trafficking. The Salvation Army.
Sorry to interrupt. What do you mean by a victim of human trafficking? Because that wouldn't have been the language at the time. What was the situation?
Yeah, so these were young people who had been young women who had been moved and sold into prostitution, really, and were working within prostitution. And a lot of these people were children, actually. Like, there were young people as young as 10 working within prostitution. And the Salvation Army came to recognise that this was happening. Florence and Bramwell both identified that there were children working in prostitution and recognised that this was not okay. And so Bramwell went to a famous journalist, collaborated with the media of the day, and he kind of recruited this guy, William Steed, he wanted to highlight what was happening in their community. And so Steed was really intentional about wanting to present the facts. And so they developed this plan where they would infiltrate a brothel to make sure that what they were publishing in the Gazette was accurate. And so they found a Salvationist female who went into one of the brothels and acted as a worker. Didn't work. So she came out and acknowledged that there were children working in the space. And then Steed and Bramwell came up with this idea that they would show how easy it was to actually purchase a child. There was an ex-brothel owner that also got involved, Rebecca Jarrett, and she was able to secure a child, and they essentially purchased a child from her mother and moved her from England across the Channel to France. And then they published this. What it did was it highlighted the issue, and at the time the age of consent was 13 years old. And so the Salvation Army started lobbying that the government increase the age to 18. Catherine Booth wrote to the Prime Minister. She wrote to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria supported the Army's, stance around the age of consent increase, and eventually it was raised to the age of 16. But yeah, the Salvation Army was really active right from our beginning in the fight against human trafficking. And so I think, human trafficking in its basic form is the purchase and sale of human beings. And, you mentioned before that there are an estimated 40 million. I mean, those figures came out kind of in 2018. And so we're expecting that new figures might come out in the next year or so, and that there'll be an increase, a significant increase because of COVID and that kind of thing. But among these 40 million, it's estimated that more than 15 million are in forced marriages, more than 24 million are in forced labour, and about 30% of those exploited are children. And so when we think of human trafficking, it's the movement of people across and within borders through deceptive means, through force or coercion. And there's kind of three main factors or indicators that mean that it's human trafficking, and that's the act, the means, and the purpose. So the act would be recruitment, transport, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons. The means would be force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or giving payments or benefits. And the purpose would be exploitation, prostitution of others, forced labour, removal of organs or other types of exploitation.
I love sort of like right back at the Salvation Army's infancy, not only were they, identifying the issue and helping people at the front line, but then also creating societal change, which is like still what we're trying to do, isn't it? And that's still so much like the heart of the Salvation Army. So I mean, Sammy, what does human trafficking look like in our territory? Does it exist in our territory? And what does it look like?
Yeah, I think we want to believe that it doesn't. We want to think that we're an isolated country and, that it doesn't happen here. But reality is that we are a destination country here in New Zealand. And last year, there was a 36-year-old man who was jailed after trying to buy a child for the purposes of sexual exploitation.
Wow.
2 years ago, there was a man found guilty just up the road from where I live over in Hastings.
Wow.
He was found guilty of 10 charges of human trafficking and 13 charges of dealing in slaves. And it's the first time in our country's history that someone was prosecuted for both human trafficking and dealing in slaves. He had brought 13 workers from overseas to Hastings between 1994 and 2019 for horticultural work. They sometimes worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week without pay. After work, they were forced to complete chores at the perpetrator's home, and they'd get beaten if his rules were disobeyed. The oldest victim was in his 50s and the youngest was 12 years old.
Wow.
And it's, to think that this is happening in my community, in our neighbourhoods, is really confronting. In 2018, an individual pled guilty to charges of slavery and sexual exploitation of a child. In 2016, someone else was found guilty of 15 charges of people trafficking.
Wow.
And since 2009, 51 victims of people trafficking have been identified.
Wow.
Recently, the liquor industry has been recognised as a space where labour exploitation has been existing. Bottle store owners have exploited migrant workers, paying below minimum wage. And while we don't know the true extent of slavery in New Zealand, Walk Free estimates that there's around 3,000 people living in slavery in New Zealand.
Wow.
So, this is likely happening in our fishing industry, in dairy, agriculture, construction, and hospitality industries. So
it's sort of
happening.
It's like exactly like you said, we don't want to believe it, but it's like you open the door into this hidden world, isn't it? And we have to face the reality that it is happening. It's something that I read that really shocked me, and I think just because it confronted me, was that some people were trafficked during the Christchurch rebuild. They were promised $100,000 to come to New Zealand for the rebuild, and of course, when they got here, it was a completely different situation. And you think something that we all felt almost invested in and part of was being used to exploit people. And, one of the sort of horrifying stories that came out of that was that, one person was forced to kill 300 calves with a hammer. And it's this sort of face of human trafficking. It feels like we have an idea of what it looks like, but actually the reality is shocking in often completely different ways that we couldn't have even imagined. And the cruelty that happens, it feels unimaginable, and therefore it's very easy to just want to close our eyes to it.
Yeah, I think also it's important for us to acknowledge that even with our own church communities, there is the possibility of people who are vulnerable to trafficking. So with one of the earlier cases of victims of human trafficking, they were actually identified in a church setting. And the people in Hastings, they'd go to church on a Sunday, but wouldn't talk to anybody. And we need to recognise as the church that we often have open doors, and people who are vulnerable come through those doors, and we need to be aware of what this could look like in our spaces. I've done a couple of awareness raising events within a church setting, and I've had people come forward and talk to me about their own experience, and all of a sudden they can put words around their own experience of being trafficked.
Wow. That's incredible. You actually reminded me when you told me about that story about the victims actually went to church, and it just reminded me that it was a church member who alerted the police that something they said made that church member think, oh, something's not quite right here. And they were the ones that raised the alarm. So I think it's really amazing to acknowledge that and to say that we actually can do something about it, and we'll talk a lot more about that later, but it's not out of our grasp if we suspect something to do something about it. And like you said, those people may well be walking in through our churches. So who is vulnerable to being trafficked, and I know there's no necessarily typical situation, but what might a typical scenario look like in our territory?
Yeah, so some of the vulnerabilities or risk factors for people to being trafficked can include poverty. So traffickers often prey on vulnerable populations and create these false opportunities for a better life. Political instability is a big one, like if we think about the war in Ukraine and people having to move and migrate because of what's happening, and natural disasters, gender inequality, where women might be seen as less than men or not receive the same kind of education as men, who might get less pay or might not have the same access to healthcare, addiction and drug dependency can be risk factors, gang involvement, online vulnerability. I mean, within New Zealand, migrant workers are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and every situation is different, and we often when we think of human trafficking and modern slavery jump straight to sexual exploitation, but that isn't the kind of key or majority form of trafficking and modern slavery in New Zealand. We recognise that forced labour would be more of what we see here. Not saying that the other doesn't exist, because it does, but it looks different for every person. But for someone in New Zealand, it might look like being offered to come to New Zealand to work in the horticulture industry, and the person being promised good wages, that they'll be able to get enough money to send back home to support the family that they're leaving. And then they get here and they're told that they need to work off some of the costs that it costed to come over, like flights and visa costs and passport costs, which is like a form of debt bondage. They now have to pay back a debt. And they might have their passport removed from them, their visa documents, their identification, and all of a sudden, in losing those documents, they have lost some power. They might not be aware of their employment rights, and they might not have their own bank account set up, and then they're forced potentially to live in inadequate living conditions with groups of other people, overcrowded situations. All of a sudden they are in this new country with potentially a new language, without any documentation or ways to connect to home, with no secure form of income, and they've lost their power. And so, that's what it can look like in New Zealand.
Yeah. And you were mentioning that, remember we talked before about the people going to church, and so it's like they're not literally in shackles. Why is it so hard for them to get help if they find themselves in this situation?
So the the perpetrators, the traffickers, the people who are keeping them as slaves use their power to exert control and make threats. And one of the ways that they might do this is by saying, if you don't do what I say, or if you talk to anybody about this, I'm going to alert the authorities and you'll be deported.
Right.
Or, I'm going to make sure that something happens to your family back home, or you know, so there'll be threats and coercion that intimidates or brings fear to the person who's been exploited, and they don't feel like they have an option. They're scared to speak out, and sometimes people who have come from other places might have a fear or concern about authorities. There might be like a distrust of the authorities. And
so, Sammy, tell me about your role. I know that as part of your role, you have been advocating to the government for something called transparency in the supply chain. Can you explain that to me and what that has actually to do with human trafficking?
So, as consumers, we actually have the potential to increase the supply and demand of slaves, and people who are trafficked simply through our purchasing. We think about cat food maybe, and think about the supply chain for cat food. It goes from, you know, the workers working in the supermarkets who we purchase the cat food from. It goes to the factories who bring the cat food, package the cat food, send it out, right back to the fisher people who catch the fish that goes into the cat food, you know. And so there are different levels of supply chain that go way back that we often don't give any thought to.
Absolutely not.
We just look for what's on sale, and we don't always consider the fact that there are human beings right throughout the process of getting that product on our shelves. And so what the Modern Slavery Act that we've been petitioning for and advocating for does is it encourages businesses to look into their supply chains and identify where slavery might exist, and where slavery is identified, do something to bring about change so that it no longer exists in the supply chains. So, you know, it calls for greater awareness, people to do their due diligence in regards to where they're sourcing things from. And it also creates an opportunity for us as consumers to know what we're purchasing and kind of what we are participating in. And it creates a level playing field for those who are trying to do the right thing and for those who are trying to minimise and prevent and stop slavery in their own supply chains. You know, there are businesses working towards that. And so,
and then they have the disadvantage if they can't charge as cheap prices.
Yeah, that's right.
The next door business.
If we think about people, the people who are fishing for the fish are our neighbours. You know, we might not know them, we might not know their name, but they are human beings who matter. The people who work in garment factories are people who matter and who deserve to live life in all its fullness. And again, this is like something that from our conception as a movement, we have been active in. So back in the early days, the Salvation Army, purchased a match factory because William Booth recognised that there was some injustice happening within the matchmaking industry. There were toxic chemicals being used to create matches, and the working conditions were really poor. There was inadequate ventilation. It was a real health and safety issue. People were getting sick. Their jaws, people were developing what's called phossy jaw. Their jaws were like deteriorating and they were becoming really sick. And so the Salvation Army purchased a match factory and had the intention, and people weren't getting paid adequately either, in these match factories. They were getting like starvation wages. And so the Salvation Army were like, this is not right. This is an injustice. What are we going to do? They purchased a match factory. They made sure that they were paying their employees a reasonable amount. They made sure that they weren't using the toxic phosphorus that caused the health and safety issues. They ensured that there was adequate ventilation. And as a result, once again, transformation happened because other match factories then had to kind of meet the standard that was being set. Legislation changed again where it eventually became illegal to use phosphorus in matches, and where the conditions of the work environment changed. And so this is part of our history. This is
what
part
an incredible
of
story.
who we are. Yeah. And so we continue that fight to say, actually, the people who are making our clothes, the people who are making our shoes, the people who are putting our phones together, the people who are fishing for, our pet food, they matter. And so what are we going to do? What's our response to make sure that they get to live their best life possible?
Absolutely. And I think while you were talking about that, a thought came through my mind that, what right do I have, especially as a person of faith who believes that everyone holds the reflection of God within them? What right do I have as a human being to ignore what other human beings have to go through in order for me to have my fashion? And, that's like a really hard one for me, and it confronts me. It makes me realize that I have something to do with that. One thing that I read when I was researching this that also confronted me was that often the people that are traffickers, it's easy to say that they're the baddies, and I mean, obviously they are perpetrators, but the traffickers are often in a very similar position of poverty that the people that are trafficked are in. So the issue at the heart of it is poverty, and the fact that the rich nations like us are demanding cheap goods overseas, and that creates the demand.
And it is so confronting when we think about that actually we are contributing to demand. So just last week, I was online in a conference where one of the speakers actually made that observation and kind of put consumers in the category with perpetrators. And I was, that's like, what? We actually have some really good tools available to us that can help us to research so that we are better able to make ethical decisions when it comes to our buying. So there's a website called Just Kai, and you can just Google that, and it talks about some of the food businesses that they've researched and that they think are probably better to purchase from.
Excellent.
There's the Tier Fund Ethical Fashion Guide, which I just love and is my kind of go-to, where it looks at different businesses, it looks at different factors of their response to ethical fashion and grades businesses. A plus being the best, I think D being the worst, and it just kind of gives us an indicator to help us purchase ethically. And there's also a website which is really confronting and really kind of surprised me, and it's called Slavery Footprint, and you do like a little kind of test or quiz, and it gives you an estimate of potentially how many slaves could be working for you through your purchasing practices. I know.
I don't like that.
I was mortified. I think it's worth having a go and reflecting on not just the number, but who are these people that are.
Exactly. It goes back to the point that you made that every human matters, and I don't matter any more than they do. We'll talk a bit later about some of the things we can do, because I don't want us to sort of end up feeling stuck in this kind of place of like self-loathing. But I did want to ask you, because you mentioned right at the beginning about how COVID has increased possibly demand for slavery. And I also know that the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, which is on 30th of July, is focusing on technology and trafficking. So these are two things that perhaps I certainly haven't considered before, and I'd love for you to illuminate me about what all that means.
Okay. So one of the things that COVID has done is it has moved people online to a greater extent than we were before. I think the number of victims and perpetrators of online child exploitation in New Zealand has more than doubled since 2019, which mirrors like a global spike since the start of the pandemic. We're seeing we're seeing some really dangerous trends among young people, taking photos of themselves, uploading them to apps, sometimes for payment. And so people might voluntarily be doing it, but what has led to that, in the sense that because of the pandemic, people have lost jobs, and it can be an entry point for traffickers to make connections with people who are going involuntarily, but then finding themselves in a situation where they've been tricked or coerced. Traffickers are using digital technology now for recruitment. The internet use has increased by 50% because of lockdowns and school closures, and it's UNICEF, they estimate that a third of those internet users are children. So traffickers offer fake jobs. These online relationships where people pretend to be who they aren't. And it's a time of economic instability for people. People are vulnerable because of losing jobs and so traffickers and people are preying on that. Over COVID and during lockdown, Pornhub's traffic increased hugely. I can't remember the percentage, but it was well over 100%. It was huge. And pornography is something that does contribute towards modern slavery and human trafficking, because it increases the demand for people to be exploited. And it's one of the key factors around sexual exploitation, online exploitation, is pornography use. Again, what we consume and the people at the end of that supply chain matter.
Absolutely. Hey, so I just want to change tact a bit and find out a bit more about your role, and as part of the wider International Salvation Army strategy, what is the Army doing to play our part in eliminating human trafficking?
So my role has come about because internationally the Salvation Army recognise that modern slavery and human trafficking is a global issue, and right around the world we are active in combating the injustice that is modern slavery and human trafficking. And so I've mentioned a couple of stories about our history, but right around the globe there are incredible stories of the Salvation Army today working against human trafficking and modern slavery. So in Congo, in the Congo Territory, there's a giving program called Operation Bottle, and they provide financial support to women and girls who are vulnerable or who have been removed from human trafficking situations. There are safe houses in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands.
Wow.
They're providing shelter for girls from different areas who were given false promises and then exploited. They support the girls through training, counselling and assistance to be returned and reintegrated back into their families and communities. In Australia, the Salvation Army's contributed to creating the advocacy for unconditional support. So this is like a model for the government to provide support without requiring immediate police cooperation.
Right.
Because there is sometimes that caution around the authorities, and they're afraid, people might be afraid to speak to the police. So the Salvation Army has been like a safety net for victims and survivors who don't want to speak to law enforcement. In Singapore, Malaysia and Myanmar territory, they operate residential care programs for sheltering foreign domestic workers, many who have survived labour exploitation. And they work to improve the well-being of the people within their care so that they are able to rebuild resilience and really be cared for. There's language classes, handicraft sessions, healthcare, like a really holistic approach. There's so many stories. And last month, there was a report that was released by the Salvation Army called Everyone Everywhere, and it is full of stories of the Salvation Army working today and what we're doing to combat
Brilliant.
the injustice. Yeah.
Brilliant. And so what are the sort of things that you've been doing, Sammy, in our territory?
Some of our key goals are around raising awareness of modern slavery and human trafficking, and we want to do this by developing country-specific training for officers, for centre leaders, for managers, for staff, and for our volunteers to educate on what human trafficking is, what it is to respond to it, and how to report it. It's about equipping core to be able to participate in the day of prayer that we have each year on the last Sunday in September. We've been developing some really good partnerships with other agencies working in the area, and we just really want to increase engagement in the fight for freedom across all areas of the Salvation Army in our territory. Like our vision is to see all people of the Salvation Army in New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga and Samoa engaged in the fight for freedom. And Catherine Booth said, if we are to better the future, we've got to disturb the present. And that's essentially what we are trying to do.
And I know, like, often when we hear about the issue, it seems so big and so impossible to tackle. I always remember a quote from Rob Fife, the CEO of Kathmandu, who said, we know more about the welfare of our sheep than we know about the welfare of our people in the production of our products. And, that was quite an honest statement. And so that's why we mentioned earlier about the work that you've been doing with legislation. And as kind of like boring as legislation can feel, this is really important work, isn't it? Because I had the privilege of speaking to the person who started it in the UK, and he was a church pastor who visited the Ukraine, and when they were in the Ukraine, they saw a young woman who was looking for someone, and the young woman mentioned that she'd been told that if she went to New York, she was going to get $80,000 for selling ice cream. And they were just on a mission trip, and they were like, that doesn't sound right. They actually, then the trafficker turned up and they managed to pay off the trafficker and save her from being trafficked. And from then, he grew a passion for stopping trafficking in the UK and started his own charity called Unseen. And they were instrumental in actually changing legislation in the UK, which meant that businesses then had to say what was happening in their supply chain, which we talked about earlier. And that's the legislation that now is being brought forth in New Zealand, isn't it? And you know what, that has got the potential to be a real game changer. And I think definitely something that we as an army and as Christians should be getting behind. I really hope and pray that that happens in New Zealand as well, so that we can start to see like systemic change. But also there's things that we can do, isn't there, Sammy? Like, what are some things that we can do if we think, I want to help change things?
So one of the things I would say, like just in regards to the legislation, I would encourage people to write to their local MPs and encourage their local MPs to support the development of the Modern Slavery Act. Like, that's one action, that's one letter that can be written. So, that's one thing. Find a way to increase your own awareness around modern slavery and human trafficking. Send me an email and I will add you to my mailing list and send updates and send what we're doing in the army, and send other things that people can participate in and be active in. Fair Trade Fortnight is coming up in the first couple of weeks of August. So host a Fair Trade morning tea. Encourage your core to switch to Hamadava.
I was just about to say that. Buy Hamadava.
The Salvation Army's very own coffee brand, and which is fair trade. So encourage your core and your core officers to make the switch to Hamadava. Supporting some of the Salvation Army programs financially is a way that we can contribute towards the fight for freedom. So we've got some education initiatives happening in Fiji, Tonga and Samoa through our sponsorship programs. So, you can find that through the Just Gifts website, and there's some specific anti-trafficking work in Tanzania that the Salvation Army is doing, and people can donate towards through the Just Gifts program. It helps girls to generate their own income and gives women and girls adequate health care when they have come out of a volatile situation. So check out the Just Gifts page and give financially. Self-denial is another way. We have a global toolbox that has lots of different ideas for core to consider, whether it's an awareness raising campaign, whether it's like creating a walk for freedom where you raise funds or simply raise awareness. There are so many things that we can do to be active, and that can sometimes be overwhelming. It might be making the switch from one product to another that is ethical, or it might even be writing to an organisation and asking them to increase their awareness around where they're sourcing things from. So, there are lots of things we can do which can be really overwhelming, but pick a few and, focus on a few for a year rather than trying to do everything all at once.
Absolutely.
Do what's manageable. Otherwise, we can sometimes look at injustice and be so overwhelmed by the reality and by the horror that we almost, it kind of paralyzes us and we feel like we can't do anything. But even if we can just pick a couple of actions, we can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And, I actually think that the great news about this is that it's not rocket science. Like, every single one of us can make some small incremental changes to play our part, and that's That's actually really good news. I'll just do a bit of a women's ministries promotion here. I don't know if you can see this coming up on screen, but we online have got this poster you can print out, and it is just things you can do right now to stop human trafficking. And they're simple things. Learn, talk to, like you said, talk to your MP. One of the big things I know for me is actually commit to changing some of my shopping habits.
I think one of the things that sometimes people might bring to the conversation is that if we stop purchasing from one space where we know exploitation exists, what about those people at the end of the of that particular supply chain? They end up with nothing, and that's a really valid question to consider and a real tension that we carry. But what we know from our history with the Match Factory is that in the changes that the Army pursued in regards to like health and well-being within the workplace and adequate pay and that kind of thing, that caused the rest of the industry to change, and so we can use our purchasing power to create changes in the industry that will be so significant.
Again, I've been very privileged in my life to talk to a few human trafficking experts in my former life as a war cry journalist, and I had the opportunity to talk to a UN human trafficking expert, Matt Friedman, and he said something that I just thought was fabulous, and I've never forgotten. And that was, he said, why not make New Zealand the first slave-free country? I'll just quote him. Why not New Zealand? Why not? You're committed enough, you're small enough and engaged enough. Let it be New Zealand. Then people like me can go to Australia and the rest of the world and say, look, New Zealand's stepping up. You can do it too. And I loved that. We can do it.
Jesus came to set the captives free. He came for freedom. He came so that people could experience life in all its fullness. And we carry his heart. We are his representatives. We are his ambassadors. We are kingdom people. And justice is a core part of who God is. God is just. And so where there is injustice, it is our duty. It is part of who we are as followers of Jesus to challenge injustice. And right throughout Scripture, we see evidence of God wanting to set people free. We see it in Exodus, where the Israelites were being kept as slaves. We see it through the prophets who again and again were calling the people of Israel to live in a way that was just and defended the rights of the poor and the widow and the orphan, and called people to live differently to the rest of the world. And when Jesus came, he came to fulfill, the law of the prophets, and he came to redeem the whole world. And so part of that redemption story is us partnering with him, so that other people will come to know him, will come to experience life in his light and the freedom that he brings.
That's the good news.
Yeah.
And
it's Jesus.
The answer is always Jesus.
Yeah.
Is wonderful. But, also we can be people that continue the story of freedom and continue that Jesus story. And that's good news for us, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Thank you so much, Sammy. It's just been really illuminating and incredible to talk to you. I'm so thrilled the Army's doing this. I'm so thrilled you're doing it. I'm so thrilled we get to be part of this huge justice movement, and we can make a difference in our world and to our brothers and sisters across the world. As you said at the very beginning, every human matters. Thanks, Sammy.